Welcome back to ILTV on the Hour. We are live from Israel, and we're here to bring you the biggest stories from Israel and the Middle East. It's 2 p.m. in Israel and 7 a.m. in New York City. I'm Caleb Ben David, and this is day 662 of the war in Gaza. Well, let's get into all the top headlines at this hour. Following a cabinet meeting last night in Jerusalem, Israel is reportedly examining new options in Gaza if Hamas once again rejects the hostages for ceasefire deal proposed by mediators in Doha. Now, among those options is a full Israeli military occupation of the Gaza Strip. Another is annexing parts of Gaza into Israel. A report in the Haaretz Daily says that Prime Minister Netanyahu presented the annexation plan as part of efforts to keep Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich from pulling his far-right religious Zionism party out of the government. Smotrich is at odds with Netanyahu over the decision to increase aid deliveries into Gaza, some via the same UN organizations the government has criticized as cooperating with Hamas. This as efforts to advance the negotiations towards a hostage deal continue, with Regional Affairs Minister Dermer and National Security Advisor Tzahi Hanegbi reportedly meeting yesterday in Miami with the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. The U.S. and Israel are trying to coordinate moves following their withdrawal of negotiators from the Doha talks in the face of unacceptable demands from Hamas. Meanwhile, the IDF continues to operate in a number of areas in Gaza, with airstrikes and ground operations, including the demolition of terror tunnels. Forces from the 401st Brigade raided a building in Jabalia that had previously been a school. The IDF uncovered weapons hidden at the site, and a 400-meter tunnel was located there and destroyed. Now, as fighting continues in Gaza, President Trump is publicly contradicting Israeli claims that there is no starvation in Gaza. Trump vowed to send more humanitarian aid to Gaza and said that Israel is going to help. Speaking from Scotland, the U.S. president said that Washington will be setting up food centers in Gaza and other nations are joining in.
We're going to be getting some good, strong food. We can save a lot of people. I mean, some of those kids that's real starvation stuff. I see it. And you can't fake that. So we're going to be even more involved. We did some airlifts before, some airdrops, and the people are running for it. And the Prime Minister is going to help us. They're very effective with that. You've done that before. And we're going to set up food centers, and we're going to do it in conjunction with some very good people. And we're going to supply funds, and we just took in trillions of dollars. We got a lot of money, and we're going to spend a little money on some food. And other nations are joining us. I know your nation's joining us, and we have all of the European nations joining us, and others also have called, and they want to be helpful. So we're going to set up food centers and where the people can walk in.
Trump's remarks come amid an international campaign blaming Israel for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Now, part of that is a photo of a 5-year-old Gazan child, Osama al-Rakab, that has gone viral and has been used to falsely depict Israel as responsible for his condition, claiming Israel is starving children in Gaza. Well, it turns out that this child suffers from a serious genetic illness unrelated to the war. On June 12th, he and his mother were taken out of Israel through the Ramon airport. He was then flown to Italy, where he is receiving medical treatment. Meanwhile, aid is continuing to flow into Gaza, with trucks arriving from Egypt and airdrops of supplies from the United Arab Emirates and Jordan. Spain today became the first European country to airdrop aid into Gaza and will supply 12 tons of food this week. The delivery will take place from Jordan using Spanish Air Force planes. Now, according to COGAT, the IDF's office in charge of coordinating government activities in the Palestinian territories, Israel in recent weeks has invested significant efforts in advancing the humanitarian response for the civilian population in Gaza. As part of the ongoing efforts, Israel employed a series of steps to boost humanitarian access. These include airdrops, tactical pauses in fighting, and even connecting Israel's electricity grid to the desalination plant in Gaza. But in a disturbing report, more than half of the Egyptian aid trucks were reportedly looted after they entered Gaza, and their contents later sold in local markets. According to Qatari media, out of 130 trucks, 73 were looted in southern Gaza in an area supposedly controlled by the IDF. Well, joining us now from the United States is Dr. Eric Mandel. He's the director of MEPIN, the Middle East Political Information Network, and a senior security editor for the Jerusalem Report. Eric, thank you for joining us. Eric, let me just start by asking you, we've heard President Trump say there's suffering, starvation in Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu tweeting, there is no starvation in Gaza. How serious is this? I won't say it's a dispute because it's not a direct dispute, but just it's sort of this differing interpretation of what's happening in Gaza between the U.S. and Israel.
I think this is very, very serious, and it is taxing Americans. Americans, and certainly President Trump, doesn't do very well with complexity. The challenges of delivering aid to an active war zone, all of Hamas dressing as civilians, that doesn't ring true when there are images, false or not, that are being put up of starving children. It has echoes for people like you and me. Remember Mohammed al-Dura, back in the beginning of the second where Israel, sort of ignited it. It was blamed for what went on, and turned out years later it wasn't even Israel's fault. But it doesn't matter. The media is more than happy to accept Israel as being the one that is causing all the problems. So, listen, if we looked at this objectively, objectives do not work here. This is all about subjectives. On a macro level, Israel has given a tremendous amount of aid over the last 18 months. Certainly more than my nation did in Fallujah. We could look at it, the combatant to civilian ratio 1-to-1 as opposed to my country being 5-to-1. None of that rings true when you see these subjective images and they're winning that battle, especially about many people who are predisposed against Israel. And in a world in America where half the population looks at a world of victim and victimizer. But Israel's done itself no favors. It never decided whether to occupy, I'm not saying annex, but occupy Gaza, distribute the aid, be in charge of it, or maximize American support and flood the zone with the strip with aid where the prices would have gone down. So the stopping and restarting aid, Israel's repeated the same strategic mistake. And then always Israel relents to American pressure. So, and I think there's the part that Bibi is dealing with, keeping his coalition together and doing things that are counterproductive, certainly to diplomatic relations. And let's be honest, there's one country that Israel must stay strong with and have a good image with, and that is the United States. Europe is kind of lost, and you can see that in many things besides places like Spain. You see what France and England are doing. So I think the politics of Israel and Bibi's survival are really hurting Israel, and especially with President Trump, who basically makes transactional, quick decisions.
Right. Now, it looks like, to your point, we're in that flooding Gaza with aid part of that cycle again. As it was reported, the U.S. And Israel are trying to coordinate a response now to Hamas's escalation of demands. Reports of Steve Witkoff meeting, of course, with Dermer and Tzahi Hanegbi in Florida yesterday. So where do you think, given the situation you described, the U.S. and Israel can move forward from this point in terms of at least handling how they're going to handle either the negotiations or other alternatives in Gaza?
Well, Hamas is making a strategic decision or tactical decision that is correct. Hamas sees no reason for a ceasefire. The world is doing their fighting for them. They're delegitimizing Israel. They're basically, you have this terrorist organization. People forget that this is a retaliatory attack by Israel from October 7th, but everybody has forgotten about that. And so from Hamas's point of view, to be conciliatory at this point of time, they don't see a reason to do that. I do hear voices here in America, and we're not talking about left-wing voice. I'm talking about people on the right who are saying, Israel, you've done as much as you possibly can at this point. You're going to have to suck it up, maybe withdraw from Gaza, leave your buffer zone, leave the Philadelphia, you stay in the Philadelphia corridor, maybe one of the other corridors, Morego and Netzarim, you could figure that out. Don't allow aid to come in to rebuild, flood them with food, and just wait it out. And, maybe your goal of getting rid of Hamas, totally is unrealistic. And maybe it really is unrealistic. Everybody keeps talking about the Palestinian civilians being innocent, and there are many who are innocent. But if there was an election today, I bet you Hamas would still win. And if they wouldn't win, they would intimidate. I think most of the population is Hamas in one form or another, even if they're not actively involved. So I think the expectations here, this is Israel's hardest war. I think Iran, which was an existential threat, and Hezbollah, and Syria, and all the other things in the West Bank and the problems. This is in Gaza, the hardest war. And unlike what Israel's done since 2003 in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, where it's been there every day and taken out terrorists, Israel had not been since 2005 in Gaza and wasn't in control. And I think it may need to change its expectations now, although there could be a tremendous breach in the relationship. And if that relationship is broken, you can start with things that are very tangible. The memorandum of understanding, the next one is coming up. There's going to be tremendous opposition to Israel receiving arms from the United States, certainly from the Democratic Party.
Well, let me ask you, though, you mentioned one scenario going forward, which is Israel making a hostage deal that would include ending the war. The other is, as you said, as we discussed earlier and reported, discussed in the cabinet, the IDF moving toward an at least temporary full occupation of Gaza, even talk of annexing parts of it. Some of this may be, as you mentioned, a tactic for political tactic for Prime Minister Netanyahu to keep the more right-wing elements of his coalition intact. But if it was not, if Israel would have moved forward on this strategy, what would the consequences would be? Would the U.S. support going forward in that area? What would be the other consequences if Israel would look in that direction?
I think Israel become a pariah nation if it annexed Gaza. I'm not talking about occupied, but annexing it and not giving them full rights. In Judea and Samaria, it's in this kind of gray zone, and maybe they think that could be analogous to what's going on. It's certainly not what's going on in the Golan when Israel annexed it, where you didn't have that many people there, and there was a clear strategic reason based upon topography. But here, reoccupying, I think it's, months or a year, maybe too late. Israel never had an appetite for this. And then you see a situation where, and I do spend time with Tzahal, with the IDF, and I'm not sure that they, on a military level, think there's that much more to do here. We're dealing now with a guerrilla war, and obviously a siege mentality has not worked. Hamas is willing to let its population starve. So I think Israel, to even consider annexation, even if it's just from Smotrich and Ben Gvir, that's going to play out as the headline of the New York Times, and that's going to be on the mainstream legacy media in the United States, with the images of the starvation. It is beyond a temporary PR problem. That's going to resonate and have legs for quite a long time. So again, if Israel goes in and maybe frames it that we need to hand out the food to people and we have to reoccupy it for that reason, maybe, but they should definitely not.
All right, we seem to have lost Eric. I don't know if could we bring him back? Yes, Eric, back with us.
Sorry about that. So annexation is definitely not on the table here. I mean, if anybody is thinking about that, I think that breach in the U.S.-Israel relationship would really have, as I said, legs. It would last, and it would not just be with Democrats. It would get into a good amount of Republicans. By the way, there are quite a few people here in the States who've been saying things, whether it was regarding the incident with the churches in the West Bank, or the accidental hitting of the church in Gaza, who've come out quickly, and even before facts are known, they're reflexively now kind of, condemning Israel. That is the mentality that's over here. And I do think that Bibi and as is known as his brain, Ron Dermer, really have a pulse on America, but I really don't think they have that much of a pulse on America. I think they are listening to people here who tell them what they want to hear. And I think it's really important for them to get some outside voices who are friends from America to tell them what's really going on, and to take a look at Israel's image as a national security imperative, along with the other 7 fronts of the war. I think that is something that is totally underestimated, how important it is here. And you have one friend in the world, and that's America, and you, Israel, are so good for America, and people have lost that. But I think what's going on right now.
Eric, I have to ask you: have people lost it? There's one thing to say, because at the same time, this is reflected in what's called sort of the elite media outlets, etc. I understand, but at least for the time being, the Trump administration has been supportive of Israel, and President Trump is still, despite perhaps disagreeing on some of the details, still seems to be more or less on the same page of Israel at this point.
He is, but again, he can change fairly quickly. I mean, I think some of the statements, along with the UK leader who yesterday showed that the president can be influenced by people, and sort of whoever is the last person in the room. I think they are on the same page to a certain degree. Whatever patience is there, I think, is wearing thin. I think Israel needs to get out ahead a little bit at this point, because, as I say, it is not just, the president also has a division in his own party. The majority of the MAGA world, I do believe, are still with the president, with Israel. But regarding supporting Israel, there is that whole part of the world that is now saying, hey, not only you're giving, aid that we shouldn't be giving, and America doesn't have the money, but look, we're supporting somebody who's doing things that are against American values. True or not true. Listen, I wrote a piece for The Hill last year because the crying wolf about the starvation. I did an expose last year. This was April 2024. There were starving children. I was talking to a national security leader in the United States, and I was saying they was getting in 2,800 calories per day, and they said, no, they can't be true. We're seeing people, suffering. But this time, I think this is real, and so I think you really need to deal with this. And Bibi has to show the leadership of being for Israel, its long-term goals, and not just about the coalition.
All right, Dr. Eric Mandel, thank you for that.
Pleasure. Thank you, Clive.
Well, speaking of that negative publicity for Israel, a new report from 2 left-wing Israeli NGOs is making some waves, accusing their own country of genocide in Gaza. But Israeli officials are pushing back hard. A joint report released by NGOs B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights leveled a serious accusation against their own government, claiming that Israel's actions in Gaza amount to genocide. At a press conference in Jerusalem, the group said the destruction of Gaza's infrastructure and the rising civilian death toll leave no doubt that Israel is deliberately targeting Palestinian society. They described the war effort as calculated and intentional, aimed at the erasure of a people. In response to mounting international criticism, Israel began implementing these daily humanitarian pauses in certain areas of Gaza, aimed at enabling aid groups to deliver food and medical supplies more safely. The World Food Program says nearly 500,000 Gazans are living in famine-like conditions, with tens of thousands of women and children in urgent need of therapeutic nutrition. But the Israeli government is calling these reports a dangerous distortion of reality. Spokesperson David Mensa flatly rejected the accusation of genocide, calling it factually and legally baseless.
When it comes to this accusation of genocide, yes, of course, we have free speech here in Israel, but we strongly reject the accusation. It is baseless. There is no intent. Key for the charge of genocide, there is no intent. It simply doesn't make sense for a country to send in 1.9 million tons of aid, most of that being food, if there is an intent of genocide. It's completely incongruous.
it's clearly having impact, especially in Europe, as Israeli tourists are once again confronted with demonstrators trying to prevent their arrival in Greece. The latest incident was again in the island of Rhodes, as the protesters attempted to prevent tourists from Israel on a cruise ship attempting to disembark. Pro-Palestinian protesters scuffled with police at the Rhodes Old City port, and some demonstrators were reportedly arrested. Last week, a similar protest took place on the Greek island of Syros. There, the passengers were instructed not to disembark for their own safety. This time, after a short delay, the Israeli tourists were able to visit Rhodes. Elsewhere, ministers from dozens of nations gathered at the UN today for the second day of a conference promoting the creation of a Palestinian state as a solution to the Israeli-Arab conflict. The meeting is hosted by Saudi Arabia and France, just days after French President Emmanuel Macron announced his country would grant official recognition to a Palestinian state in September.
Elle donne raison à ceux qui, en Palestine comme en Israël, sont des acteurs de paix, ont toujours rejeté le terrorisme et ont toujours rejeté la violence. Elle donne tort au Hamas, qui a toujours combattu la solution à deux États et ne reconnaît pas le droit d'Israël à exister. En retour de cette décision capitale de la France, des engagements historiques seront pris, seront cristallisés aujourd'hui et demain à New York. Cette conférence est donc une étape décisive. Une étape décisive sur le chemin qui mène, bien sûr, jusqu'à l'émergence de cette solution à deux États, qui mène jusqu'à l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies au mois de septembre, au cours de laquelle la France formalisera, par la voix du président de la République, sa décision de reconnaissance, et où nous comptons sur la mobilisation collective qui devra se poursuivre avant qu'il ne soit trop tard.
Now, both Israel and the U.S. are boycotting the UN conference. State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce said in a statement, the U.S. will not participate in the July UN two-state solution conference. This is an ill-advised stunt that will further embolden Hamas and undermine our serious diplomatic efforts to end the war. We will continue to work with partners towards a resolution. Well, joining us now for more is Tommy Steiner, Policy Director of the Signal Group and an adjacent lecturer at Reichman University's Lauder School of Government. Tommy, in contrast to a previous discussion about the U.S., with Europe, there's no question. Europe is turning against Israel significantly. We see France recognizing, saying they're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Other countries may be leaning in that direction. How serious a development is this for Israel?
First of all, good afternoon, Khaled. These are dangerous and problematic developments. On one hand, it is very important not to overstate the extent or level of these developments, because the fact that France will recognize a Palestinian state doesn't mean that a Palestinian state is going to be created in September. And we have had a situation in which there have been European countries that have already recognized the Palestinian state, and the sky hasn't fallen through. So I'm less impressed by those diplomatic stunts. The more disconcerting issue is that Israel is in the risk of being castigated as a pariah state, and this blur on its image will stick long after the war in Gaza will come to an end, and will be considered the likes of Saudi Arabia and other countries in our proximate region. Now, I'm not sure that is something that we should desire for, but that is, in my mind, the more strategic long-term threat, rather than recognizing a Palestinian state. Because, by the way,
let me give you one example relating to Europe, because reports that the EU may choose to cut funding for this Horizons project for Israel, or important funding for research, scientific research. There are many ways, short of recognize a Palestinian state, that, for example, the EU could damage Israel. Is that a threat?
Again, the details are important here. Because the Horizon grants that you just referred to are not money that the Europeans are giving Israel. It's based on money that Israel is putting into that pot of Horizon. Now, it's true that Israel, unlike most of the other European countries, is getting more than it is putting into that pot, but the difference is not huge. And I would argue that Europe needs Israel in the Horizon program, not less than Israel needs Europe for the Horizon program. So it's a bit more complicated than that, and I, again, do not get excited. There is a problem there in the Horizon program, and that's the issue, I think, of a more non-official approach that is, less favorable to Israel when it comes to the so-called judges on the scientific committees that have to decide who gets what funding. There is a problem. That's where the problem lies. This is the issue of image. This is exactly what I'm talking about. It's not the official statements. It's the unofficial statements, the unofficial acts.
Let's talk about that. We see acts of violence against Israelis. I could cite many of them, that what happened in Rhodes, etc. How much is that could be a problem, just simply on the ground level for Israelis in Europe?
Again, and by the way, we also have to understand this anti-Israeli violence and anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic violence. Let's call it for what it is also part of a broader phenomenon in Europe of an anti-Western strike, anti-colonialism, trying to disparage their own historical legacy of European countries by Muslim activists that have found their soulmates in the extreme left. This sort of populism, but this violent, vile populism is affecting not only Israel, and it will soon start to affect established European elites. And at that point, I think there will also be a reaction to it. And we have to look at it at a broader context. And there is a reason. Look, at the end of the day, we have to understand that Israel has operated for nearly 2 years with rather considerable impunity in Gaza. We did things that nobody believed that the international community would let us do, and we've done it. Now, of course, the circumstances were extraordinary. And when you look at the total devastation in Gaza, it is heartbreaking. But the only difference is that the embeddedness of Hamas in the Gazan urban and dense urban setting has made it impossible to outroot Hamas without considerable collateral damage for infrastructure and for the urban setting. We know that. We regret that. But you can't have it both ways. Now, the Europeans, and that is the reason why the Europeans went along with Israel, even if it was quiet, even if it was unofficial. But Israel has not been limited in its operations considerably until only in recent months. Because, again, we made stupid choices with regard to humanitarian aid.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that. Tommy Steiner, thank you for joining us on ILTV.
Thank you for having me.
And in closing, some sad news for the Israeli entertainment world today. One of the nation's leading actors, Alon Abutbul, has died at age 60. He collapsed while swimming in a beach north of Tel Aviv. The reasons for his death are still unknown. Now, Abutbul first gained fame playing a soldier in Lebanon in the war film Two Fingers from Sidon, and went on to star in numerous films, TV programs, and stage productions. He also scored roles abroad in such movies as The Dark Knight Rises and Munich. I had the pleasure to interview him at the very start of his career 40 years ago and felt he had a big future ahead of him, which he did. May his memory be a blessing. And that's a wrap for this edition of ILTV on the Hour, broadcasting live from Israel in the heart of the Middle East. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more.